The other night, I was having dinner with a colleague of mine. We had crossed paths just for a couple of years at a academic institution. While I was focused in clinical psychology, their focus was on industrial organizational psychology with a specialty in diversity. She works a lot with bringing diversity into organizations, setting up policies and procedures to have it be a place that is more welcoming and belonging. But we also share an interest in Buddhism. And she began telling me about her experiences over the last year of going to a couple of different retreat centers. She said she went to one that really kind of focused on bringing the body into meditation, which is something she was really, really interested in. And she said at first it seemed normal. She didn't know anybody there. But then it seemed like people weren't showing up the second and third day. By the third night, people were drinking. And on the fourth night, someone came over and asked her to take a walk and said how attractive they found her and said, this is meant for us to be together and for us to meet here. It was synchronistic. It was auspicious. She was very, very unnerved. That's not the way she felt at all. She really felt intruded upon. And so the next day she talked with the leader of the retreat, and the leader of the retreat quoted a line that's from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, but I think the leader was missing the meaning, which is something along the lines, if you want to control your cows, you need to give them a big pasture. So basically the leader was saying, at this retreat, whatever people bring goes in some way. She ended up not staying, and it felt traumatic to her, and she went back to Deer Park Monastery, that was founded by Thich Nhat Hanh. And she said she hadn't been there in several years, but while she was there, everyone was so kind and so nice. People generally followed the rules. There would be kind of a rule for socializing about an hour a day, and she'd walk with people, and people were interested about each other, and people were polite. And then when that hour was over, people would go back to their study or silence. And she was just comparing and contrasting these two experiences. Even after Thich Nhat Hanh's passing, the norms and the behavior and the culture and the feel of that monastery or that retreat center continues on. What was it about that institution that framed these connections, this desire to collaborate with one another, this desire to track and follow one another, to love each other the best that we can? So generally, when we're thinking about norms, we're kind of blending this in with culture. So in a general way, culture would be these kind of broad values, beliefs, and worldviews that an organization may have. So we're looking at America. I think we're still in this kind of modernist, patriarchal kind of view of whiteness. Let's get everything done now. And this always leads to that, and kind of control through power and authority and separation in some way. So kind of these worldviews can kind of get embedded into the rules or the behaviors or the practices. So maybe the laws in some way, or what's allowed, right? There's been a lot of conversation that seems like ethical digressions are more and more allowed in our culture in some way. So culture would be what's meaningful, what's important, and then do we somehow define that and make that message explicit? We both implicitly and explicitly set boundaries for what is acceptable behavior and even maybe what behaviors we would like to promote. This kind of shows in how we treat one another, and if someone steps outside these norms, whether it's the peer group or someone, a leader in that organization, steps in and says, that's not how we do it here. It makes me think of just having so many children come over to my home in my role as a father, and setting the norms and expectations for how we will do things in our home. We won't scream, we'll be respectful to one another, We'll try to form collaborations and have win-win decision making in some way. These games are allowed. These games we don't play in this house. We don't do video games, for instance. So these kind of values are kind of transmitted either through talking or just subtle modeling of what we do. And oftentimes they'll have kind of a nationalistic or ethnicity or racial underpinning. And they'll often be context specific, that I'll act one way in conversations will be one way at a temple. They'll be different when I'm running into neighbors on the street. They'll be different in the various academic settings that I teach in. It's important for us to realize that whether we know it or not, we're acting within some kind of norms of behavior. Now, often these can be explained, but usually it's much more subtle. When you walk into a new environment, you're looking around and you're seeing how people stand, talk, how much they talk, who talks, and you're immediately picking up on what's the culture and the behavioral norms of that setting in some way. And then you're seeing whether people break those norms or you don't know where the norms are. And if you do something, if you get corrected in some way, or trying to figure out what the boundaries are, what's allowed and what's just too far. So I wrote a series of contemplative types of questions, and you could pause the video and think about these if you'd like. When do you feel the most inside a group? And what are the norms that support you having a sense of belonging in that group? And when do you feel like an outsider? And what rules kind of make you feel like you're excluded in some way? So it just makes me think, in my academic position, there's certain sides of me that I can bring forth and are promoted for me to bring forth. And there's maybe more personal or family of origin or cultural norms that are not expected of me. It'd be interesting for you to consider how these norms are different in the different groups you're a part of. What happens to the people who break the norms? Is there formal talking to? Does it happen in the moment? Does it happen afterwards? Are they socially punished in some way and excluded, mocked, made fun of, talked about behind their back in some way, right? To basically get in line. This is how we do it here, right? And then sometimes there's people who are allowed to break the norms and don't suffer consequences. The classic do as I say, not as I do. I guess the question I have is, how do you feel about adapting to different cultural and situational expectations? I adapt to the various academic institutions I'm a part of. I'm a part of a variety of both service groups and friendship groups. And generally the groups I remain in, I feel like I can adapt to what the norms are. But what is too far for you, and what may you have to leave or maybe try to change these norms in some way? So I'll end with these kind of reflections, right? I often start when I teach group workshops, like think back about a group in your life and how has a group that's been positive, formative, supportive, helped you learn, helped you grow, help you develop, help you dream, help you move towards your desires? What were the aspects of that group or that organization, right? And what other groups may have been harmful or injurious or somehow held you back? And as you look back upon the norms in your life, what norms are you continuing to bring into your current life? Would often sing jazz standards to my mother. Maybe you are the promised kiss of springtime that makes only winter seem long. And my mom would pretend she didn't like it. But this was a behavioral pattern we did that I think expressed closeness, respect, love, admiration, and even her putting us off. When people came over to the house, if new friends came over, they'd be like, what was that all about in some way? And then you can think of the norms you have been in and what messages you got of what you aren't supposed to do and whether they stay with you in some way. And what norms have you found that when you've entered an organization or a group really help you feel belonging? So inevitably, when two people get together, they have a bunch of family of origin and cultural norms, and they'll inevitably be misinterpreted, misunderstood, and hopefully talked about. Why do you do this? This is what I was thinking. I didn't realize its impact on you. Now, these norms we get socialized depending on our race and our gender and our class and our ability and our religion. We get socialized to act in a certain way. Judith Butler calls this we perform in her work as a gender in some way. And then the question would be, how much do you shift in the various groups that you're in? Are you somehow different at work than you're with your friends and you're in a academic setting in some way? And how do you feel about role shifting? Do you feel like this is adaptable, or do you feel like it brings out the best in the whole group? Or is there some residual feelings that you wish it was more like the groups from your past? Generally, when we're talking about norms, these are kind of collectively agreed upon expectations and guidelines for how people will interact with one another, how people will act, right? They kind of represent a level of commitment of this is what's expected here and this is what I'll do. The more they can be made explicit, the more clarity there is. This is all from both industrial organizational psychology research and group psychotherapy research and community psychology research, but it fosters trust when people know the norms, and it fosters effective collaboration. How might we disagree? Do we let each other finish? Do we make our point and then be quiet? Do we raise our voice? Do we go on and on? Do we talk about the personal impact that behavior had? Do we pull in the research? So different settings will have different norms about how you communicate, and particularly how there's conflict, including that conflict may be ignored. I'm a member of an ongoing psychotherapy group or two, and in one of the groups there was a woman in the group from German ancestry whose parents were involved in the Nazi Party. And I told the story about how one of my best childhood friends was the child of people who fought for Germany in World War II, and how my father was Jewish and how my father fought for the United States in World War II. And I said how wonderful I thought that was, that they could see beyond this, and my interpretation of this was they were both just trying to basically survive and raise a family. And their superordinate goals of this was more important than what happened in the past. And she made a very poignant point that perhaps they're not working it through, and perhaps they're just kind of burying it, and perhaps it was coming out in some sideways ways. It's very powerful for me to reflect on those relationships I had. I think this is what's wonderful about being a part of a community, a healthy community, or some kind of group, psychotherapy or supervision or training or service groups, where you can get additional points of views that can be really expansive for you and for you to see things in new ways, right? As therapists, we're like fish. We got to keep moving forward and growing and seeing things in new ways. It will help us serve our clients in the best ways. Pulling on the variety of research, I kind of wanted to highlight some of the ideas that having strong, explicit group norms really improve performance. And that performance could be, say, in a clinical staffing supervision meeting, talking about the clients in a way that will be able to benefit the clients and help the clients. In this case, becoming a better psychotherapist in some way. And having these norms and discussing them really brings kind of a sense of ownership, but even more kind of a sense of safety. You're not questioning what's expected or what to expect from others. So you can kind of settle into the environment in some way. So when this isn't provided, when there aren't norms presented, expectations presented, the research shows a lot of negative outcomes. And this has been a big part of my work. And I had a client say to me in my group recently that they thought that what made this group helpful for them was really not anything super insightful that I said. I wasn't, this is a doctoral student studying group. It wasn't that I was implementing all the therapeutic factors and the process research, but I really put such a focus and attention on having not disruptive, aggressive, destructive kind of things go unchecked in the group. And that this was a norm that we can disagree, we're promoted to disagree, and we're also promoted to disagree and share our views respectfully, and then to consider views and to some degree kind of work as a group to try to understand things in a new way or a bigger way. So often when group norms aren't reinforced, there can be task drift. I remember running a residential treatment program, and I would say, okay, we have 6 clients to talk about today. Let's spend 10 minutes with each client. And immediately people would talk about a client and talk about their own kind of horror stories with substance abuse, kind of war stories. And then it would go on and they'd talk about how they related to the client. And we'd be 25 minutes into that kind of supervision meeting. And the goal of that meeting was lost. Whatever the task is can get lost and really may not achieve what everyone was hoping to achieve in the time allowed it in some way. So it's a very hard balance to find how much to talk about the dynamics that are occurring, explore them, and how much to get the group back on track in some way. Ideally, you need some of each. When norms aren't clear and behavioral expectations aren't clear, there's often been a lot of splitting, people leaving the organization, people getting mad at the organization. But when they are clear, there's much more engagement and there's much kind of levels of satisfaction. And this works across corporate teams to the classroom. So ideally, norms are kind of a collaborative process. I think a typical way they get developed is whoever's in charge presents some norms. There might be some discussion about the norms. It's good to welcome multiple points of view about what's going on. And then cultural clashes will be inevitable, that people will be from different work environments, different culture environments, and see things differently. And that these will have to get discussed, and eventually the leader will have to try to find, with collaboration with the group, that we can agree on these. Depending on the setting, sometimes the leader may have to be more forceful about, we're not going to allow people to use drugs in our supervision consultation meeting, right? You can't come to this meeting drunk or high in some way. And then everyone will kind of have to be able to tolerate that the norms aren't exactly what they would like. And they have to try to work within these in a win-win. And when people are unable to do this, I can think of when I've supervised groups at conferences, the leaders would try to say what the norms are, and then people would say, no, I need them to be this way. And then I would have to come in and ask that person to leave because it's just not going to work in that setting if they're unable to collaborate with the leaders and with the other group members in some way. We've talked about this by having norms and people following the norms over time. There's increased trust. There's increased kind of open communication. There's an increased sense of safety. And then again, whatever the task is that the group is trying to accomplish is much more likely to accomplish that. When there are no norms outlined, it makes me think of Lord of the Flies. It just becomes chaos. People don't know what behaviors are allowed or not allowed. This is too far in some way. So when you're talking about a group, we already said people won't unanimously 100% accept them. but ideally people can agree to give them a try to explore how this works, to kind of explore the norms, to particularly note when the norms aren't being followed, and then what happens when the norms aren't being followed. Do people look the other way? And then behavioral norms get further and further away from the expectations, and people may become mean or harsh or not responsible or self-centered in some way. With my dinner with a colleague, we were talking about academic institutions we were in with kind of very laissez-faire management and leaders, and how the staff and the faculty like bickered with each other, and the students bickered with each other, and it was constantly kind of a power struggle about this is what we're trying to do in this class in some way, and like who said so, why, and there was no kind of final word of this is what we're doing, and it was just allowed to grow into chaos, really, and probably not helpful for anyone, and people would often leave such organizations. Looking at the research in higher education, norms in the classroom or norms in a group really kind of make people participate more. It leads a class accomplishment in some way. And really, it's very important for there to be both peer-to-peer reinforcement of the norms and noting when someone's stepping outside the norm. And then, of course, peer-to-leader norms, whether it's the leader acting outside the norms and expectations, or whether it's someone who's part of the group acting out of this. Endless research in many traditions in psychology and team functioning. You can think of sports teams. You can think of personal experience. I think of musical bands I've played in where there's been a growth mindset that we'll work on this, we'll get better. When someone did a good job, we will offer praise. When something didn't feel right, we'll talk about it and try this again in some way, particularly with this idea that this is not an individual activity in a band. It's creating a joint project for the enjoyment or meaning for other people in some way. Groups, even despite the fact that we try to make these very explicit and you can write them down and there can be policy and procedures, very often what's happening is that there's a written set of norms, and then there's a set of norms that people actually follow in some way. One group wants it this way, another group would like it a second way, another group would like it a third way. And the recommendation is that these subgroups become transparent. It could be someone in the group, it could be a leader. This is how I'm seeing our dilemma. There's 3 views about how to proceed, or how to work in this class, or how to work in this meeting, or how to work in supervision. And ideally, the groups can be shifting and changing in some way and almost permeable, that people can go back and forth, new subgroups can form in some way, and that working eventually towards this idea of there's no perfect way of working. This is how we'll do this. And I think it's very important to break out of these kind of polarized subgroups, because ideally we can all be in a subgroup with anybody else in any situation we are in, that we may see things similar, at least in some way, with everyone else. And then when the subgroups are unable to talk or be permeable or can't agree, really stronger intervention is needed, or the task of the class or the task of the supervision meeting will not take place. So I say all this thinking of you in community lab course, and I'm hoping that to some degree you have been able to co-create the norms, co-create these with the instructors in some way. And I guess I would ask you to consider, not just in this course, but really currently in your life, right? What are the norms in the various groups that you're a part of? How implicit are they? How are they talked about? And how implicit are they not talked about and just kind of understood? And would it be helpful Oftentimes, when there is some kind of rupture in a group setting or between individuals, it's because they have a different assumption or a different understanding of what the group norms and expectations are. And then you can ask yourself in these various groups, how did these norms develop? From the second we walk into a group, norms are getting developed. We're seeing how people act, and we may model that or we may note that. We're seeing what the communication is, and we're very implicitly, outside of our awareness, often taking in all this information. A wonderful conversation with my colleague about really from the first time they visited Deer Park, there was a sense of kindness, a sense of we're here to practice. There's a sense that we're here to support each other in personal growth in some way, and a tremendous amount of interpersonal kind of sensitivity. I'm sure Thich Nhat Hanh had a very large part in setting up these norms, and once norms are established, they're kind of self-reinforcing. So even after his death, these norms continue on. So I hope this is helpful of some ways to consider what the norms are in a group and how you might work with them, notice them, what norms may be helpful for the task at hand, what may be better handled in another situation. I can think of certain things that were handled best, say, in a psychotherapy setting, more so than in a clinical team meeting setting. If I'm talking about people still needing the war stories or still feeling the need to be joined with, accepted, and seen, which is very, very important as part of the group. But that, in this example of a clinical supervision meeting, that wasn't the task and that wasn't the goal. The goal was really about being benefit of others and figuring out how we could best serve those that gave their trust to us, that we could find a way to help them or at least give it our best. So you can consider in the groups you are in, are the norms benefiting you and others? Might they need some adjustment in some way? Might they need to get talked about? Is there potential some tension or rupture? Could this be with different assumptions about the norms or different expectations that could be explored in some way? So every group immediately has norms. So you sit down at lunch with different people, subtly the norms of what that lunch will look like are being reinforced in some way. When you go to a store, there's certain norms. When you go to different, say, musical shows or different professional conferences, there's certain norms of behavior that have been reinforced and subtly modeled and subtly presented as this is the way we do it here. Not that they shouldn't be examined, but you should kind of heighten your awareness to what are these very subtle, often unspoken messages. And how do you feel about it? And is there anything you'd like to do about it? Is it good enough? Is it not the place for you? Right? I've left many jobs. I've left many organizations. I've stayed at organizations, even talking to my colleague, even though we both eventually left that academic setting, we both feel very, very fondly of it. And when we get together with each other or with others, there is that sense of curiosity, scholarship, kindness, personal disclosure.